It was supposed to be a speech defending his mentor. Instead, a red pen line through 3 sentences proved to Truman that the war hero was actually a moral coward. That single editorial decision, made in the cramped carriage of a campaign train, did more than just delete a paragraph. It severed a friendship between 2 of the most powerful men on earth and set the stage for the coldest inauguration day in American history. It transformed a relationship built on mutual admiration into a bitter feud that would leave the outgoing president and the incoming president staring straight ahead in stony silence, refusing to acknowledge the other's existence while the world watched. At 8:45 a.m. on January 20th, 1953, that silence was deafening. President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower sat in the back of a black limousine parked beneath the north portico of the White House. The protocol was centuries old, a rigid dance of democracy. The incoming man enters the people's house, greets the outgoing man, and they travel together to the Capitol. It is a ritual designed to demonstrate continuity, a visual promise that the Republic survives the transfer of power. But Eisenhower was breaking the script. He refused to step foot inside the building. He would not share a cup of coffee with Harry S. Truman. He would not offer the customary courtesy call. He sat in the car, his breath visible in the 49-degree air, waiting for the President of the United States to come to him like a servant summoned to the curb. Inside the executive mansion, Harry Truman stood by the window, watching the stationary vehicle. This was not a scheduling error. This was not a misunderstanding of etiquette. To Truman, the man in the car represented a profound betrayal of character. The tension was so thick that the White House head usher, J.B. West, later remarked that he was simply glad he wasn't in that car. CBS correspondent Eric Severide, witnessing the scene, noted the hostility with just 3 words. It was shocking. To understand why the Supreme Allied commander refused to walk 20 feet to shake the hand of the man who had once offered to give him the presidency on a silver platter, we have to peel back the layers of political calculation and personal insult that defined the 1952 election. This was a fracture caused by the poisonous atmosphere of the Red Scare, where the price of power was often the sacrifice of loyalty. The man waiting in the limousine, Dwight Eisenhower, was 62 years old and arguably the most popular living American. He was the victor of Europe, the man who had accepted the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, and a 5-star general who had commanded millions of men across 2 continents. He was accustomed to kings and prime ministers seeking his counsel. In the election that had just concluded, he had secured 55% of the popular vote and a crushing landslide of 442 electoral votes. He was the definition of American strength. The man inside the house, Harry S. Truman, was 68. He was a farmer, a haberdasher, and a machine politician who had been thrust into the presidency by the death of Franklin Roosevelt. Yet this former artillery captain had made the hardest decisions of the century. He had authorized the use of atomic weapons. He had drawn the line against Stalin. He had integrated the armed forces and fired the legendary Douglas MacArthur when he threatened civilian control of the military. He was a man who valued loyalty above almost everything else. It is tragic because, for a brief window in history, these 2 men were not just allies, they were nearly partners. The hostility of 1953 was born from the ashes of a profound mutual respect. The relationship began in the ruins of the Third Reich. In July 1945, on the Autobahn outside Potsdam, Germany, the newly sworn-in President Truman rode in a car with General Eisenhower. Truman, overwhelmed by the legacy of Roosevelt and the dawn of the atomic age, saw in Eisenhower the perfect embodiment of leadership. During that drive, Truman turned to the general and made a promise that sounds fictitious in modern politics. He told Eisenhower that there was nothing he might want that Truman wouldn't try to help him get. That included the presidency itself in 1948. Truman was not posturing. He meant it. 2 years later, in 1947, Truman doubled down on this offer in a private diary entry. He wrote about a conversation where he proposed a radical political maneuver. Eisenhower should run for the presidency, and Truman would gladly step down to run as his vice president. Truman viewed the White House as a great white jail and genuinely believed Eisenhower possessed the moral authority the nation needed. Eisenhower refused. He was a soldier, he insisted. He had spent his entire adult life in the rigid hierarchy of the Army, where the objective was clear and the enemy was uniformed. Politics was a muddy, chaotic business he wanted no part of. He claimed he would serve his country in uniform, not in elected office. Truman accepted this refusal. He respected it. He awarded Eisenhower the Distinguished Service Medal multiple times. They worked together to build NATO. When Eisenhower eventually decided to run in 1952, not as a Democrat but as a Republican, Truman was disappointed, but not enraged. He felt a sting of betrayal that Eisenhower was running against the administration that had supported him, but that was politics. Men are allowed to change their minds. Men are allowed to switch parties. What Truman could not forgive, what caused him to look at the car in the driveway with genuine disgust, was not the fact that Eisenhower ran. It was how he ran. Specifically, it was about what Eisenhower was willing to do and who he was willing to throw to the wolves to secure the victory. The breakdown of their relationship and the reason for that cold silence on Inauguration Day centered entirely on a third man who wasn't even present, General George Catlett Marshall. If Eisenhower was the face of victory in World War II, George Marshall was the brain. Born in Pennsylvania in 1880, Marshall was a man of stoic brilliance. As Army Chief of Staff from 1939 to 1945, he had taken a military force of fewer than 200,000 men and expanded it into a global machine of 8 million. He was the architect of the Allied victory, the man Winston Churchill credited as the organizer of victory. But for Dwight Eisenhower, George Marshall was more than a superior officer. He was a mentor, a patron, and a father figure. In 1941, Eisenhower was a lieutenant colonel, virtually unknown outside the military establishment. It was Marshall who reached down into the ranks, saw the potential in the Kansan officer, and rocketed him over hundreds of senior commanders. It was Marshall who recommended Eisenhower to lead Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, a command Marshall famously denied himself because President Roosevelt felt he could not sleep if Marshall was out of Washington. Eisenhower owed his career, his fame, and his path to the presidency to George Marshall. After the war, Marshall continued to serve. He became Truman's Secretary of State, architecting the Marshall Plan that saved Western Europe from economic collapse and communist absorption, earning the Nobel Peace Prize. He later served as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. However, in the paranoid fever dream of the early 1950s, a distinguished record was no shield against political opportunism. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, riding high on a wave of anti-communist hysteria, decided that the best way to elevate his own profile was to tear down the giants of the previous age. McCarthy didn't just attack Marshall's policies, he attacked his soul. In a speech on the Senate floor in June 1951, McCarthy delivered a 60,000-word diatribe that history now views as an act of insanity. He accused George Marshall of being part of a conspiracy so immense that it dwarfed all previous crimes in human history. McCarthy claimed Marshall had consciously lost China to the communists and was serving the interests of the Kremlin. These were not subtle critiques. They were allegations of treason against a man who had literally dedicated his life to defending the United States. President Truman was apoplectic. He regarded Marshall as the greatest living American. To Truman, an attack on Marshall was an attack on the country itself. He assumed that Eisenhower, the man who owed Marshall everything, would swiftly and brutally crush McCarthy's lies. But Eisenhower was now a candidate. And in the calculus of the 1952 Republican primaries, Joseph McCarthy was not just a liar, he was a power broker with a loyal base of voters. Eisenhower adopted a strategy his historians would later call the hidden hand. He reasoned that directly engaging with McCarthy would only amplify the senator's platform. He told his aides, "I will not get into the gutter with that guy." He believed he could destroy McCarthyism more effectively by ignoring the man and letting him burn himself out. To Truman, this wasn't strategy. It was cowardice. The tension reached its breaking point in the autumn of 1952. As the campaign heated up, Eisenhower found himself forced to make compromises that stained his conscience. The first major crack in his armor occurred in Indianapolis in September. Eisenhower was scheduled to appear with Senator William Jenner. Jenner was perhaps even more vile than McCarthy. He had called George Marshall a living lie and a front man for traitors. Eisenhower despised Jenner. Yet the political reality was that he needed Indiana's electoral votes, and Jenner controlled the state party. His advisers told him he had to play the game, and so the great crusader, the liberator of Europe, stood on a stage and allowed William Jenner to embrace him. Photographers snapped the image, Eisenhower and Jenner, arms around each other, smiling for the crowd. Privately, Eisenhower was repulsed. He later confessed to an aide, "I felt dirty at the touch of the man." The psychological toll of that embrace was immediate. Eisenhower felt he had degraded himself. To wash away the stain of the Jenner incident, he decided he would do something bold. He would use his next major appearance to draw a line in the sand. His campaign train was heading toward Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy's home state. Eisenhower decided that he would go into the heart of McCarthy's territory, stand on a stage in Milwaukee, and deliver a full-throated defense of George Marshall. It was to be a moment of redemption, a way to prove that while he might shake hands for votes, he would not stay silent when honor was at stake. Speechwriter Emmett Hughes drafted the text. It was powerful. It was specific. It read, "The right to question a man's judgment carries with it no automatic right to question his honor. I know that charges of disloyalty have in the past been leveled against George Marshall. I know him as a man and a soldier, to be dedicated with singular selflessness and the profoundest patriotism to the service of America." This paragraph, known later as the 74 Words of Praise, was inserted into the speech titled Communism and Freedom. It was a direct challenge to McCarthy, who would be sitting on the stage nearby. Eisenhower's team even leaked the intention to the press. Reporters were told to expect fireworks. They were told that Ike was finally going to take the gloves off. But as the campaign train chugged from Peoria, Illinois, toward Milwaukee on October 2nd and 3rd, the political machinery began to grind against the candidate's conscience. Wisconsin Governor Walter Kohler, Jr., a powerful Republican who was trying to bridge the gap between the moderates and the far right, boarded the train. He joined Eisenhower, his campaign manager Sherman Adams, and the terrifying presence of Joe McCarthy himself. In the tight confines of the train car, a fierce debate erupted. Kohler pleaded with Eisenhower. He argued that delivering that paragraph in Milwaukee would be an unnecessarily insulting slap in the face to McCarthy in his own backyard. He warned that it could fracture the party in Wisconsin, potentially costing Eisenhower the state's crucial electoral votes. Kohler insisted that Eisenhower had already defended Marshall in a press conference in Denver back in August. Why reopen the wound here? Why pick a fight that could lose the election? The pressure was immense. Eisenhower was looking at the map. He believed that he needed to win to save the country, to end the Korean War, to manage the Soviet threat. Could he risk all of that just to say 74 words about a man who already knew Eisenhower respected him? Eisenhower wavered. He looked at the political calculus, and he blinked. He ordered the paragraph deleted. The red ink that crossed out those 74 words did not just alter a speech, it altered the moral landscape of the election. The tragedy of the moment was compounded by a catastrophic administrative error. Eisenhower's campaign staff, believing the defense of Marshall was a done deal, had already distributed advance copies of the unedited speech to the press corps. The reporters sitting in the press gallery of the Milwaukee Arena were holding the original text in their hands. They were waiting for the moment. They had their pencils poised, ready to circle the quote that would prove Dwight Eisenhower had the backbone to stand up to a bully. On the evening of October 3, 1952, Dwight Eisenhower stepped onto the stage of the Milwaukee Arena to the roar of 10,000 people. Standing beside him, basking in the reflected glory of the war hero, was Senator Joseph McCarthy. The crowd was electric. They cheered for Ike, and they cheered even louder when McCarthy raised his arms. Eisenhower moved through the speech. He spoke about the need to fight communism. He spoke about the need to root out subversion in the government, effectively endorsing the very crusade McCarthy had built his career on. In the press section, the reporters followed along, line by line, waiting for the pivot. They waited for the paragraph where the general would turn to the senator and draw the line. They reached the spot in the text. Eisenhower kept reading. But the words he spoke were not the words on the page. He skipped the paragraph entirely. He said nothing about George Marshall. He did not mention his mentor's name. He did not defend his honor. He simply moved on to the next section, leaving the defense of his friend on the cutting-room floor of political expediency. The reporters looked at each other in disbelief. It wasn't just an omission, it was a surrender. But the night had one final indignity left to inflict. As the speech ended and the applause washed over the stage, Joseph McCarthy saw his opening. He knew exactly what had just happened. He knew the general had bowed to him. McCarthy turned toward Eisenhower and lunged forward, his hand extended. Eisenhower saw him coming. According to witnesses, the general seemed to stiffen, perhaps wanting to recoil, but he was trapped by the lights, the crowd, and the political necessity of the moment. McCarthy grabbed Eisenhower's hand and shook it vigorously. He held it high in the air, like a referee declaring a winner in a prize fight. The cameras flashed, capturing one of the most infamous images in American political history. The Supreme Allied Commander, the man who had crushed the Third Reich, standing frozen while he was physically and morally embraced by the man who had called George Marshall a traitor. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Because the press had the advance copy, they knew this wasn't an accidental oversight. They knew it was a calculated choice. The headlines the next morning were scathing. The New York Times ran the story on the front page. Columnists who had previously supported Eisenhower expressed their disgust. One Republican editor wrote a line that would haunt the campaign, stating that Eisenhower had sold his soul for a mess of pottage. But no one was more horrified than Harry Truman. For the sitting president, reading the news reports of the Milwaukee speech was like watching a man commit moral suicide. Truman had spent his life in the rough-and-tumble world of the Pendergast political machine in Missouri. He understood compromise. He understood that sometimes you have to shake hands with unsavory characters to get a road paved or a bill passed. But this was different. This was personal loyalty. This was a soldier betraying his commander to appease a slanderer. Truman's reaction was visceral. When reporters asked him about the incident, he didn't mince words. He told them, "I had never thought the man who is now the Republican candidate would stoop so low." In private, his language was even harsher. He viewed the deletion of those 74 words as moral blindness. In a later speech, he elaborated on his disgust, calling the incident one of the most shocking things in the history of this country. He finally delivered the ultimate verdict on Eisenhower's character, a judgment that would freeze their relationship for a decade. "The trouble with Eisenhower," Truman said, "is he's just a coward." Truman decided to make the betrayal of Marshall the central theme of his campaign appearances on behalf of the Democratic candidate, Adlai Stevenson. He traveled the country reminding voters that George Marshall was the greatest living American and asking them a simple, devastating question. If Dwight Eisenhower could not stand up to Joe McCarthy and William Jenner when the pressure was on, how could he be trusted to stand up to Joseph Stalin? Eisenhower heard these attacks, and he was furious. In his mind, he was being pragmatic. He believed he was playing a long game, a hidden hand strategy where he would eventually undermine McCarthy by ignoring him rather than giving him the oxygen of a direct confrontation. He convinced himself that Truman's attacks were just partisan mudslinging, that the president was using Marshall's name as a political weapon. Eisenhower felt that he was the victim of a smear campaign, ignoring the fact that he had handed Truman the ammunition. The campaign descended into a brawl. Eisenhower pledged he would go to Korea personally to end the war, a move Truman dismissed as a cheap campaign trick. Republicans attacked the Truman administration as corrupt, incompetent, and soft on communism. Truman fired back, labeling Eisenhower a stooge for Wall Street and a puppet of reactionaries. By the time Election Day arrived in November 1952, the bridge between the two men had been burned, the ashes scattered, and the earth salted. The result of the election was never really in doubt. The American public wanted a change, and they wanted the general. Eisenhower won in a landslide, taking 55% of the vote and shattering the Democratic hold on the Solid South. But the victory did nothing to heal the wound. In fact, the transition period would only twist the knife deeper. On November 18, 1952, 2 weeks after the election, the president-elect came to the White House for the traditional transition meeting. It was a disaster from the moment Eisenhower walked through the door. The atmosphere in the Oval Office was described by historian Stephen Ambrose as stiff, formal, embarrassing, and unrewarding. Truman, sitting behind the resolute desk, tried to do his duty. He wanted to ensure a smooth handover of the massive machinery of the federal government. He had prepared detailed briefings on the structure of the White House staff, the flow of intelligence, and the daily grind of the presidency. Eisenhower sat across from him, radiating impatience. He didn't take notes. He barely asked questions. His body language screamed that he did not need to be lectured on leadership by a former haberdasher. When Truman tried to explain the complexities of foreign policy and the delicate balance of the containment strategy, Eisenhower seemed disinterested. He later wrote dismissively that the meeting added little to my knowledge and that he felt Truman was merely trying to defend his own record rather than help the new administration. Truman was equally unimpressed. He watched Eisenhower's demeanor and concluded that the general was in for a rude awakening. After Eisenhower left, Truman turned to his staff and offered a prophetic warning about the difference between the military and the presidency. He pointed to the empty chair Eisenhower had just vacated and then to his own desk. "He'll sit right here," Truman said, "and he'll say, 'Do this, do that,' and nothing will happen. Poor Ike. It won't be a bit like the Army. He'll find it very frustrating." Truman understood something Eisenhower had not yet learned. The power of the presidency is not the power to command. It is the power to persuade. In the Army, an order is absolute. In Washington, an order is just the opening bid in a negotiation. As Inauguration Day approached, the pettiness escalated. Eisenhower made a point of breaking with tradition in small, stinging ways. He announced he would wear a Homburg hat to the inauguration instead of the traditional silk top hat. It was a sartorial snub, a signal that he was rejecting the old ways of the Truman era. But the real conflict was about the car ride. Tradition dictated that the president-elect would come to the White House, enter the residence, greet the outgoing president, and then they would ride together to the Capitol. Eisenhower made it known through intermediaries that he did not want to enter the White House. He did not want to eat lunch with the Trumans. He did not want to make small talk. He wanted to pick Truman up at the curb, like a taxi driver, and get it over with. This brings us back to the morning of January 20th, 1953. The moment the car stopped at the North Portico, Truman had considered refusing to go out. It was an insult to the office of the Presidency to make the Commander-in-Chief walk out to a waiting car. It was a breach of protocol that bordered on insubordination. But Harry Truman was a man who revered the institution more than he indulged his own ego. He swallowed his anger. He put on his coat and hat. He walked out the door. The photographs from that moment show the tension in the set of their jaws. Truman climbed into the back seat. Eisenhower did not slide over. He did not get out to help. They sat side by side, staring straight ahead. As the limousine pulled away from the White House and began the slow roll down Pennsylvania Avenue toward the Capitol, the silence inside the vehicle was heavier than the overcast sky above. Mamie Eisenhower, sitting in the car with them, tried desperately to break the ice. She commented on the weather. She pointed out the crowds, but the two men remained stone-faced. Then, halfway to the Capitol, Eisenhower finally spoke. He turned to Truman, but not to offer an olive branch. He asked a question that revealed he was still thinking as a father and a soldier, suspicious of political machinations. He asked Truman who had ordered his son, Major John Eisenhower, to be pulled off the front lines in Korea and brought back to Washington for the inauguration. John Eisenhower was serving in a combat unit. The war was still raging. Men were dying every day. Eisenhower was worried that his son's presence in Washington looked like special treatment, the kind of privilege he had always tried to avoid. He demanded to know who had authorized it. Truman looked at him and replied simply, "I did." The outgoing president explained his reasoning. He told Eisenhower that he believed it was right and proper for a son to witness his father being sworn in as President of the United States. Truman had quietly used his authority as Commander-in-Chief to issue the order, not for publicity. He hadn't told the press, and he hadn't used it in the campaign, but as a profound gesture of human decency. He knew the historical weight of the moment, and despite his hatred for Eisenhower's politics and his disgust at the Marshall betrayal, he wanted the man to have his family by his side. It was a moment that should have melted the frost. It was a gesture of pure grace. But Eisenhower, perhaps too entrenched, in his anger or perhaps too stunned, said nothing. He offered no thanks. He simply turned his head back to the window and watched the crowd. The car arrived at the Capitol. The transition occurred. Dwight D. Eisenhower took the oath of office, becoming the 34th president. Harry S. Truman, now a private citizen, slipped away to Union Station. He boarded a train back to Independence, Missouri, without a backward glance from the new administration. He would not set foot in the White House again for 10 years. For the next decade, the silence between them was absolute. Eisenhower sent a few pro forma invitations to official events, which Truman consistently declined, viewing them as insincere publicity stunts. When asked about Eisenhower, Truman would reportedly say he couldn't mention the man's name without using profanity. They were two titans of the American century, living in a state of frozen hostility. It would take a death to bring them back into the same room. And fittingly, it was the death of the man whose honor had caused the rift in the first place. In October 1959, General George Marshall died at Walter Reed Hospital. His funeral was held at the Fort Myer Chapel in Virginia. The protocol of state funerals is rigid, and it dictated that the president and former presidents sit together. So, on October 20th, 1959, Eisenhower and Truman found themselves sitting side by side in the first pew. They sat inches apart, united in grief for the man who had made both of their careers possible. Marshall, the man Eisenhower had failed to defend. Marshall, the man Truman had revered. Yet, even in the shadow of the casket, the ice did not break. Witnesses observed that they did not speak to each other during the service. They sat in silence, two stubborn men guarding their grievances. After the service, they parted ways without a handshake. It seemed that the feud would follow them to their graves. But history has a way of softening edges, and tragedy has a way of rearranging priorities. The thaw, when it finally came, arrived in the wake of a national nightmare that made their personal quarrel seem suddenly trivial. In the years between the Marshall funeral and the final reconciliation, they had maintained their icy distance, occasionally forced into the same room by the inescapable formalities of state. They both attended the funerals of Chief Justice Fred Vinson and Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn, and they were both present for the passing of Eleanor Roosevelt. Each time they were civil but cold, acknowledging each other's presence but refusing to truly engage. The decisive moment, however, arrived in November 1963 with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas. The nation went into shock, and the surviving former presidents, Truman and Eisenhower among them, traveled to Washington for the state funeral. On November 25, 1963, as the funeral procession moved from the Capitol to St. Matthew's Cathedral and then to Arlington National Cemetery, Eisenhower and Truman were directed to ride in the same car once again. This time, they were joined by Mamie Eisenhower and Margaret Truman. On this ride, the silence was finally broken, not by small talk about the weather, but by the weight of shared experience and national trauma. They discussed the assassination itself, debating whether Kennedy's death was the result of a vast conspiracy or a single, lone gunman. In a moment of professional consensus, both veterans of global power agreed that the assassination was most likely the work of a lone gunman. They talked about the global political landscape and the immense challenges facing the country, speaking like statesmen who understood the irreplaceable burden of the presidency. Following the graveside service at Arlington, Margaret Truman, showing a graciousness that transcended the decade of feuding, invited the Eisenhowers to join her father for lunch at Blair House, where the Trumans were staying. The Eisenhowers accepted the invitation. For 1 hour, Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower sat together in an informal setting, sharing sandwiches and coffee. They reminisced about old battles, both political and military, talking easily like two old men who remembered what mutual respect felt like. Admiral Ronald Dennison, a White House aide present for the spontaneous gathering, later recalled the scene as really heartwarming, noting that one would never have guessed there had been differences between them. When it was time to leave, Truman and his daughter walked the Eisenhowers to their waiting car. The two former presidents stood on the sidewalk for a few final minutes of conversation. Then they shook hands. It was not the cold, forced interaction of the 1953 inauguration, nor the silent, strained moment at the Marshall funeral. This was a long, lingering, silent handshake, a powerful, wordless acknowledgment of the decade of pride and anger that had just ended. Margaret kissed Eisenhower on the cheek, and Mamie kissed Truman. 10 years after that morning in 1953, when the victor refused to cross the threshold, they had finally found their way back to something resembling friendship. They would meet only one more time in Kansas City in 1966 for a United Nations luncheon. Eisenhower's brother, Milton, observed them together and confirmed that all the old animosities were finally forgotten. The two men who defined the mid-century American story died within 3 years of each other. Dwight David Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, at the age of 78. He had served 2 full terms, overseeing the construction of the vast interstate highway system, ending the Korean War, and managing the early, desperate years of the Cold War with a calm, military precision that Truman feared he would lack. His presidency left a lasting, positive impact on infrastructure, foreign policy, and the domestic political consensus. Harry S. Truman died on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. He spent his post-presidency in Independence, Missouri, building his presidential library, writing his memoirs, and remaining politically active, a staunch defender of the Democratic Party and its causes. The story of their clash, culminating in the silent refusal on January 20, 1953, passed into American political folklore. The sight of the incoming president refusing to set foot inside the executive mansion became a powerful symbol of how personal grievances can poison the solemn performance of public duty. The incident was never about minor issues like scheduling, protocol, or a choice between a silk top hat and a Homburg. It was, at its heart, a conflict over a perceived, unforgivable betrayal. Eisenhower felt betrayed by Truman's brutal campaign attacks, particularly the public accusation of moral cowardice that questioned the integrity of a 5-star general who had commanded the world's most powerful army. He believed Truman's relentless partisan criticism was unfair, especially since Eisenhower rationalized his actions in Milwaukee as a necessary element of his hidden hand strategy to dismantle McCarthyism without granting the demagogue the dignity of a direct presidential fight. For Eisenhower, the temporary compromise was a pragmatic sacrifice for the greater goal of winning power and preserving the dignity of the presidency from the gutter. Truman, however, felt a deeper, more fundamental betrayal. For him, the question was not strategy, but character. Eisenhower's willingness to stand on stage with men like Joseph McCarthy and William Jenner, men who called George Marshall, the very man who created Eisenhower's career, a traitor, was an abandonment of the basic military and personal code of loyalty. Truman saw Eisenhower's political expediency in Milwaukee as evidence that the general would sacrifice principle for electoral advantage, compromising his own values to win. If Eisenhower would abandon his mentor for votes, Truman reasoned, what would he abandon as president when faced with the enormous pressure of the Soviets? Both men had justifiable reasons for their anger, and both men allowed those personal grievances to override their responsibility to the moment and to the office. The inauguration ceremony is not about the two individuals in the car. It is about the continuity of democratic governance, a visual demonstration to the world that the nation's institutions are stronger than any individual's pride. Eisenhower forgot this when he stubbornly refused to walk through the door of the White House. Truman remembered it when he chose to set aside his own justifiable fury and walk out to the car anyway. The long, silent handshake at Blair House in 1963 was a quiet, necessary correction. It suggested that 10 years later, both men finally understood what they had truly lost: the mutual respect they had shared, the collaboration they might have achieved, and the opportunity to prove that, even in the most venomous political environment, a unified transfer of power matters more than the deepest personal insult. On that cold January morning in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower made his political calculation and refused to cross the threshold. The insult landed. The damage was done. And for 10 years, two of the greatest Americans of the 20th century remained divided by pride, anger, and the memory of a threshold neither man would cross. This story reveals that even the grandest moments of public service are fragile, vulnerable to the corrosive cost of personal conflict.